Hello Internet and welcome to This Day in History for the 20th of November. Where are we today? We go back to 1945 because it was on this day in 1945 that the Nuremberg trials began. The trials that were to judge 24 high-ranking Nazis and many other Nazi military officers and lower functionaries for various crimes committed during the Second World War. Now, this was an interesting concept because this was probably the first time in history that an entire state apparatus and everyone in it was actually held responsible for the actions of that regime committed during the war and during its command. During the Napoleonic War, it wasn't as if there was any collective judgment of those who had served Napoleon, even in the highest capacity, at least not from their enemies. The inbound new king who had replaced Napoleon certainly did perform a few purges of his own. But again, even after the First World War, that was, as I discussed a couple of weeks ago, probably the most radical change of the social order that has ever taken place in the history of the world. There wasn't some demand from the victorious Western powers to seek any real kind of personal justice or vengeance or legal warfare against the participant of German high command. Even though, of course, there were some kind of penalties leveraged against some. Hindenburg, who had been basically German dictator for a while with Ludendorff, eventually ended up as Reich president without any kind of pressure from the outside to get him away from such position. Of course, it was in fact Hindenburg that for about a year acted as a slight bit of brake on the fascistic tendencies of Adolf Hitler when he became Reich Chancellor in 1933. The same thing can be said to have occurred all through history, that no one was ever really held legally responsible for atrocities committed, and there have been many atrocities committed. That was just considered part of how the world worked. The Nuremberg trials, where the victorious powers put German high-ranking military and civil officials on trial for various crimes, was a novelty in the world of international politics, and I am not going to say that I'm sure it was necessarily for the overall best of modern-day diplomatic interaction and, in fact, to a certain degree, warfare, because it, if nothing else, while every single one of those executed probably had very, very much deserved it one way or the other, many of the military commanders, for instance, were also convicted of stuff such as crime against peace. Now, while it's true that they probably can be said to have committed crimes against peace, I consider that honestly a rather problematic issue for the future, since it was hardly the Wehrmacht officers who had decided whether or not the war should be fought one way or another. Whether or not they should have been convicted of war crimes, that is dependent on an individual level. Most of the higher ranking officers absolutely deserve the convictions they got on that point, but for instance, the concept of charging a general or someone who had perhaps risen to be general during the war with crimes against peace, I feel is creating kind of the backblow that today means that Americans will never send any of their public officials to be tried at the International War Tribunal at Hague, where several crimes against the peace could be leveraged against modern-day American generals for various wars fought in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places, no matter your stance on those wars otherwise. I guess before this runs away with me and becomes a very long video, I consider the Nuremberg trials a important and significant development in the world of international diplomacy, inasmuch that it renders any nation responsible to the rest of the society of nations from not only a diplomatic but also a moral and legal perspective, rather than simply a diplomatic perspective where you are primarily responsible for keeping to various treaties committed to by your nation and your leadership. In fact, I even have some discussion about whether or not you can claim complete wisdom in the concept of rejection totally of the idea of I was given orders to perform and I followed them. Again, this is not in any way an excuse for any of the creatures on trial and convicted in Nuremberg, so I guess I will finish here before, again, this goes way too long, and maybe one day make an actual video about the problems I have with the Nuremberg trials as such. Well, anyway, I hope this has been of some interest to you despite its rambling nature. This day in history for the 20th of November. The Nuremberg trials begins in Germany in 1945 after the Second World War. Until next time, I have been the Sage, and I wish you all a very happy day.